We are all brought here to
Yay.
listen to you, Marty, and so we're very excited about the bubbling thoughts that are boiling away behind your skull. And I'm really happy today to host Martin Sieff. Cynthia can't be here unfortunately today, but she's here in spirit. So happy 4th of July, everyone! And it's
Yay.
a weird particular time to be celebrating Independence Day, since the United States is not feeling very independent right now for many of us.
Exactly.
But despite that, there was a painting that caught my eye, which was painted by Benjamin West, the great American painter who founded and was a co-founder and became the president of the British Royal Academy of Fine Arts in the 18th century, a friend of Benjamin Franklin. And he was asked by Ben Franklin to paint the Treaty of Paris, the signing of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. And it's a fascinating painting that I think really embodies the time that we're living very well, because it's a painting which is wonderfully done, but only the American delegation is there. Ben Franklin, John Jay, 2 others are there in the painting, but the British refused to show up for their sitting. And so it remained unfinished to this very day. And it's a very fitting imagery, because the United States of America, which had that revolution that established on this earth for the first time in history a nation founded upon the idea of the inalienable rights of human beings and the general welfare of all of the nation as what would be the guiding principle of the laws of the land forever. It was never a completed revolution. It wasn't finished in 1783. So I think that painting it's fitting that we're not also finished. And as we've looked at the last 250 years of history, there has been a struggle between these 2 opposing characteristics within the United States, for the good and for the evil. So whenever we're in a crisis, I've noticed that the common denominator amongst great people thousands of years ago or in more recent times always is to not get swayed or moved by the chaos and tempestuous array of chaos that the senses can pick up, but rather are able to lift their spirits and minds above that chaos, to look down on the patterns of history, the patterns of their lives, and to look for universals that shape all of human nature for all time. And what better place to find some of these lessons in dense poetic ways, but in the works of great art, great classical art, specifically the works of Shakespeare, which is bountifully arrayed with all sorts of insights into universal characteristics of the human condition, as well as political dynamics, which I think are just as relevant in Lincoln's time as they were in Shakespeare's time, as they are today, and as they will continue to be hundreds or even thousands of years into the future, God willing. We can avoid a dark age. So, provided that human mass extinction is something that is not in our cards and we can creatively leap outside of that fate, then we have some very interesting times ahead of us. So with that, Martin Sieff, who is a great friend, a collaborator, a colleague, who has given wonderful classes on Shakespeare. He's given wonderful classes on political science, on history. What a better way to celebrate the 4th of July than to tie both of those elements together in one presentation with an exposition, an exploration of the mind of Lincoln, and especially how Lincoln was affected and given insights by his studies and love for Shakespeare. So Marty, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's widely known that Abraham Lincoln loved the work of Shakespeare, liked to quote from it. And like so much else in modern historiography, alas, people acknowledge this, acknowledge the truth, but they ask no questions. They skate on thin ice. They don't crash through the ice, they simply ignore what's below it. And you don't have to look very far, because what is fascinating to me here is first of all, the centrality of Shakespeare to the greatness of Lincoln, to making Lincoln the man he was and to winning the Civil War. And I did not even dream when Matt and I were bouncing the ideas around, and Matt, bless him, eagerly seized on this idea. This conception is Matt's, it is not mine. But you hit the nail on the head, because most of you have it sat through or you can look back on it. I know Matt has it, I think, still filed here. My presentation that Shakespeare was Christopher Marlowe, and that Marlowe was an architect of the deep state in Britain, in England. And Marlowe, of course, is the opposite the Marlowe, who supposedly died tragically, only I think 29, no 20, yes, 29 years old in 1593, is the opposite of what Shakespeare is supposed to be and what Lincoln actually was. Lincoln and the historical William Shakespeare are ignoramuses and virtually illiterate, and yet they are to become geniuses, and these are great mysteries. What made them literate intellectuals and profound geniuses who stand up there with Plato and Aristotle? I don't say Socrates because Socrates doesn't exist. Socrates is a buffoon who Plato raises up. And I recommend to everyone here, I saw that wonderful look in your eye, Matt, and I've said this before, The Trial of Socrates by my late dear friend, I.F. Stone, the great American left-wing critic of empire and dissident, and mentor of an extraordinary number of people, from Peter Jennings of ABC to me personally when I first came to Washington. But chase up the book, The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone, separately. But as I say, in my first, I realized as I was putting this lecture together, this is really part 2 of the lecture I gave on Marlowe. Because my resolution for Marlowe, and I'm not at all original in this, I stand on the backs of tremendous minds and scholars, most especially Calvin Hoffman, who you have to look at the book, The Man Who Wrote Shakespeare. The historical Christopher Marlowe is exactly the opposite of the universal myth about William Shakespeare. The universal myth about Shakespeare is forced to acknowledge the inconvenient truth that here was a virtually illiterate man whose wife and daughters could not write, had to mark their names with an X in every legal document they wrote in all of their life, of whom there is not the slightest record whatsoever that the historical William Shakespeare, the manager and minor businessman of the Globe Theatre in London, ever had a library, ever owned a single book. We have no documentation for any of this whatsoever. And he certainly learned nothing. And yet, what do we find in the works of William Shakespeare? We find the most profound theological knowledge. We find the most profound, accurate knowledge of Italy, not of other countries, but he knows Italy like the back of his hand. He knows Venice the way only citizens of New York City know New York City in an age when there was no mass media. How does he know all this stuff? How does he speak these languages? How can there be so many accurate Latin quotes, every one of them flawless, studied throughout Shakespeare? When we look at Marlowe, there is no mystery. Marlowe is a genius and known to be so from his early ages. Although he comes from a working class background, he goes through a very high-powered school. Mental block. Remind me the city he's from in the south of England, but it's well known. And then he goes to Cambridge University. And by the time he's 19 or 20, he's already a trusted agent of the Crown. And as I documented in my previous lecture, if you look at Marlowe is the opposite of the myth of Shakespeare. He's also the opposite of Lincoln. Lincoln is a theoretical genius who, when he's already over 50 years age, gets real political power for the first time, but is already prepared for it because he studied the works of Shakespeare so much. He has lived a life in books so profoundly and deeply that they prepare him for a life of action in his 50s. And a life of the mind in his 50s. By contrast, what we find with Marlowe is precisely the opposite. A brilliant intellectual, but a man who is a man of action before he writes and publishes his first play. A man who is deeply involved, as his plays reveal, and as what we know of from scholars of his history reveal. In the deepest, by the time he is only 22 years old, he is already involved in the forging and manipulation of documents to embroil Mary, Queen of Scots, in faked up charges of espionage so that Queen Elizabeth I of England can be provoked into cutting her head off. Does this sound familiar today in modern America, or perhaps modern Ottawa as well? A naive head of government, or even an experienced head of government, being manipulated by her own bureaucracy, by her own state officials, by her own deep state to carry out measures which they regard as essential for the survival of the monarch and the survival of the state, but which the monarch or president themselves are abhorred by and do not want to do, but they are manipulated by their own deep state servants. Francis Walsingham, top spy master of England as director of Central Intelligence. Does this start to sound familiar? This is the world the writer Shakespeare, I maintain, comes from. Because this is the world we see reflected in Shakespeare's plays. And as I said in my first lecture, this is a world Shakespeare, the historical figure, could have no conception of. But Marlowe had lived, knew all about from the inside. And I can prove this to you very easily. Read the plays. It is all in the plays. And 250 years later, who reads those plays? Abraham Lincoln reads those plays. And this is, so we are building two conceptual bridges here. The first one, in the 1570s and 1580s, is at Cambridge University, were not William Shakespeare of Stratford. Canterbury, that's where they come from. It's, interestingly enough, already the central city in English literature. The Canterbury Tales of Geoffrey Chaucer. Canterbury is at the heart of English popular and quality culture already for hundreds of years before Christopher Marlowe is born there. Stratford-on-Avon means nothing. Stratford-on-Avon in Canada is more significant by far than Stratford-on-Avon. And I don't say this lightly, because Stratford-on-Avon in England is a myth. Stratford-on-Avon in Canada is at the heart of transplanting Shakespearean culture to Canada and to North America. And great artists, wonderful actors of enormous stature, like the Native American actor who I particularly revere, Graham Greene, and the late Christopher Plummer, until Anthony Hopkins, the oldest man, I think, ever to win an Oscar, come through Canadian Stratford. So I rate Canadian Stratford extremely highly. But there is no bridge between the historical William Shakespeare, the dolt, and the extraordinary wisdom and depth and statecraft and dark wisdom revealed, exposed in Shakespeare's plays. But when you look at Christopher Marlowe's background, Marlowe doesn't invent this stuff out of his head. He has observed it, he has processed it, he has lived it. Marlowe has an extraordinary insight that a couple of writers in the Bible have. The lady author who is the J author in the texts of Genesis and the books of Kings and Samuel, who reveres characters like Joseph, the secret police chief of ancient Egypt. What the Bible actually says is very different from what the Bible is devoutly assumed to say. Characters of the Bible are very different, but the key figure here is a very obscure little book that is revered in the Jewish tradition for naive reasons, and it's quite the opposite of what it's revered for. The Book of Esther, which is really a John le Carré novel or a historical history about plots in the Persian Empire to prevent a genocide. And the hero is a spy master, Mordecai, and his supposed niece or cousin, who is really his mistress, of course, and it's very clearly indicated as such. And that is Queen Esther, who is placed upon the king to counter the genocidal plot of the evil prime minister and vizier Haman. And this plot, the plot of the Book of Esther, is exactly the same plot as one of John le Carré's classical dramas, which is actually set in the Middle East, focused around the Israeli Secret Service, The Little Drummer Girl. In both cases, a genocidal but charming and charismatic villain who threatens to destroy the entire Jewish people. The Jewish spy master places a beautiful young woman on him as a honey trap and uses the access they get from this to set up the assassination or an elimination of the genocidal figure. But where I come back to Shakespeare is, why do I say the Book of Esther is not the romance it's supposed to be? Because we now know from archaeology and history and the Greek historians that the Book of Esther is historically accurate. It describes the bureaucracy and government of the Persian Empire from the inside out. Most of all, it describes how command communications and intelligence are operated at the height of the Persian Empire in great detail. It explains how commands are sent out, how messages are intercepted, how a pony express, before the electric telegraph, the finest form of communication conceivable in human condition, is used to send messages out to Jewish communities and to garrison leaders to prevent genocidal attacks taking place. In the Book of Esther, we see conceptions of command and control, and Colonel John Boyd's OODA loops, which are only developed by the most advanced military in Germany in the 1930s and in the United States in the 1980s and 90s by the late Colonel John Boyd, and it's all there in the Bible, in a tiny little book of only 8 chapters called the Book of Esther. I recommend everyone here to read it, but read it in a modern, informal translation, and do not read it as a lovable fairy tale. Simply read it as factual history. That's all you need to do. Now, am I going off on one of my favorite tangents here? In a way, but really it's relevant, and I'll tell you why. Because we see the same phenomenon precisely in Shakespeare, in the plays of Shakespeare or Marlowe. We see repeatedly, we see it in Hamlet and in other plays, secret messages for assassination being sent out, messages being intercepted. Even in The Merchant of Venice, there is a legal scene, a trial at the climax of the movie, which reads like a Perry Mason episode. Perry Mason here, there was one episode of Perry Mason, there were several when Raymond Burr couldn't meet the crushing schedule, so they brought in guest stars to trial and to fill in the role. And one of them, memorably enough, was Betty Davis. And it's fascinating watching her because she doesn't bother acting. She isn't playing anything credible. She's just being Betty Davis. But that's all you need. I mean, she was a world star for 45, 50 years. And she has the authority and the intelligence and the toughness. Like Margaret Thatcher, you don't doubt for a second this lady is going to wipe the floor with everyone inside. She is the perfect Portia in The Merchant of Venice. Because Portia, Shakespeare, or Marlowe understands legal processes. And he'd be great as an American lawyer on the Supreme Court because he understands the fundamental point of a modern law. Modern law is a form of exerting or influencing or distorting power. It's not about justice. It's about winning cases and getting things done. And there was one of the most famous conceptions in modern American political legal theory that Portia anticipates, that Marlowe Shakespeare has her anticipate in The Merchant of Venice. The concepts, first of all, of literalism and of original intent. Because remember, Shylock is the guy who brings the case to court, to the courts of Venice. Because Antonio has signed, like the drunken idiot he is, you know, if I don't keep my payments up to the loan shark, you can kill me. You can cut a pound of my flesh out. It's a legally binding document according to the laws of Venice. This is centrally repeated, hammered home again and again in The Merchant of Venice. Again, you have a man here writing this who is an intellectual, who is either a lawyer or has the intellectual capability to be a world-class lawyer, right? And how does Portia get him off the hook? By being Judge Robert Bork, by going back to literalism and original intent. She says, yes, we do not, our side, Antonio's lawyers, me, we do not dispute the legality of this case. We do not dispute that you have a complete legal right to take a pound of Antonio's flesh. Of course you can, cut it away. But that's all you can take. You can't take any of his blood because it's not in the document. Now, by the way, since this is Christians going against Jews at a time when every Christian falsely believed obsessively that Jews drank Christian blood at the Passover every year in the unleavened bread they baked. This is a lie, and it's a mad, evil fantasy. It was originally used by the Romans against the Christians, of all things, nearly 1,400 years before the time of Shakespeare himself. And the Christians later shamelessly simply put it up and imposed it upon the Jews. It's a fantasy, but it was universally believed. And Marlowe presses this button, this anti-Semitic, lethal fear button in The Merchant of Venice. There were no Jews in England, except one or two who'd been lynched in Shakespeare's own time. Nobody knew any real Jews. They didn't know that they didn't have horns and tails. So The emotional impact of saying a Jew is after a Christian's blood in a play more than 400 years ago has huge impact in Shakespeare, Marlowe, right? But what Portia then does is she applies Judge Robert Bork, the original intent, and she takes a narrow constructionalist view of the Constitution. But in America, over the past 120 years, the idea of law as a tool for social justice, as a tool for equality, as a tool for the liberation of the oppressed, really only starts with Justice Louis Brandeis. He develops it as an outstanding legal scholar up in Boston before World War I, and then he's put on the Supreme Court afterwards. And he never gets any of his judgments through in the Supreme Court. The liberals only take over the Supreme Court thanks to Franklin Roosevelt's long tenure in office in the late 1930s and in the 1940s. But they adopt Brandeis's model of law as an organic idea to advance the liberal agenda. And by liberal agenda, I do not mean the globalist agenda here. There's an overlap, but I basically mean the agenda of law as a tool for social justice and equality, and the expansion of democratic rights and democracy. In America, it's the states' writers, the people who were the South in the Civil War, the white supremacists, who go back to the idea of Robert Bork and original intent and narrow construction of the law, okay? But what does this tell us? It tells us that Shakespeare's plays are saturated with legal conceptions. That this is the writer of the plays of Shakespeare, whether he was Shakespeare or Marlowe, is a profound, complex intellectual. And anybody who reads these plays obsessively will get an education in politics and in English history and in constitutional law. And what was Abraham Lincoln? He was a lawyer. Did he ever go to legal school? Not in the modern conception of the word. And again, we find this fascinating here. Here is a man who went to very primitive schools on the frontier, right? But we forget a very basic truth about the frontier, that all the best American scholars of the West and the frontier and American expansion point out. You had the same thing in Canada, though I think it was discouraged by the British government to a significant degree in Canada. And it is this, that the American West, both the expanding frontier from Appalachia in the 18th century, all the way through across the Midwest, across the prairies, all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to the Wild West, which is really kind of the shriveled last stand of the open frontier in the 1870s and 1880s, which from 1950s and 60s TV shows and movies is our conception of the West, right? The John Ford conception of the West. All of those areas were literate regions because there was no television, there was no radio. Until the 1860s, there were no railroads. There were long cattle drives. There were small isolated towns across the West. And this did not depress culture. On the contrary, it advanced it. Marshall McLuhan, like so many intellectuals, is a double-edged sword. He's a force of immense darkness. And I think, again, Matt especially and Cynthia have done brilliant, groundbreaking work in this area. But you also see him looking backwards. He's a Janus figure. He looks both to the past and the future. And there's an element in McLuhan which is tragic. He says, the age of literacy is over. I love the age of literacy, but we have to face the fact that it is over. We are going into a new world where television has created a completely new conception of human consciousness and the human mind. We have today. If McLuhan was alive today, he would be saying, post-television, post-broadcast humanity suffers from attention deficit disorder. You cannot keep an attention for more than 5 minutes. But in the 19th century, it was the golden age of literacy. 1,000-page novels were written, and the longer a novel was, the more likely it was to be a bestseller because people had long, lonely nights. This was especially the case out in the countryside or out in the wild American frontier or in Russia. But what you find, it was also true in unhappy homes. You couldn't have the solace of a television show. You couldn't have the solace of watching your favorite sitcom every week or every night. People were left alone with their immediate families, even if they loathed them, or far worse, with the memories of loved ones who had died because death rates were still so high from so many diseases. And where did people find the strength to go on? Where did they find the human warmth and companionship to go on? In literature. So Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Proust and so many others can produce extremely long masterpieces. And many lesser novelists will also produce long books that are satisfying to the readers. And Shakespeare is the great pioneer of this. And what we then find is in the 19th century on the frontier, there is a passion for Shakespeare. John Ford, the most underrated and profound of modern American and even world directors, catches this, especially in the movies that he specialized in and loved doing and that he publicly pretended to despise so much, the Westerns. The key reference here is My Darling Clementine, his novel of his movie starring Henry Fonda, who also plays Abraham Lincoln in The Young Mr. Lincoln. And this is made 7 years later in 1946, I think, or maybe 47, doesn't really matter. Ward Bond, by the way, is in both of them as well. Wonderful character actor. But Doc Holliday, the tragic gunfighter dying of tuberculosis, is played by the previous beefcake hunk star, Vic Merrill. I stand to be correct on the name here. And Ford gets out of this guy who was known before as simply being a hack romantic actor, a performance of extraordinary tragic depth and power. And this is the guy who reads Shakespeare as his character and quotes Shakespeare from memory. And there is a performing troupe. Now, does John Ford make this up? No, because first of all, the frontier was saturated in Shakespeare, saturated in it. And secondly, because John Ford was a close personal friend, and this is one of the most incredible things for anyone to get their mind around, of Wyatt Earp himself. Wyatt Earp lived until the 1930s. John Ford was a pallbearer at Wyatt Earp's funeral. Wyatt Earp discussed with him the gunfight at the OK Corral repeatedly. In all the movie versions of the Battle of the Gunfight at OK Corral, it's always set up in the classic movies like the Battle of the Bulge. You know, there's music playing, it's dramatic, it goes on forever. It's at the end of the movie, right? But in My Darling Clementine, Ford, the master of the gunfight, the man who defines the gunfight showdown in the Western, right, is not like that at all. He has the gunfight at OK Corral, a scene of intense action that lasts less than 1 minute, because that's the way it really was. And he knew this because Wyatt Earp himself personally told him this. They were personal friends for 20 years in Hollywood. I want to let that sink in. Because you see, when Abraham Lincoln picks up Shakespeare, he has a love affair with Shakespeare. He reads Shakespeare deeply, profoundly, from the time he is a teenage boy, all his life. And what we find, there was a Smithsonian article that you can easily look up. I didn't even know this existed. I mean, I prepared my lecture as I thought, and I revised it yesterday because there's an excellent article from the Smithsonian of all people. I've been very critical of the Smithsonian in much more profound areas. But when it's harmless enough stuff from their point of view, they produce interesting material, other scholars do, is this. That it tells us what Abraham Lincoln's favorite reading in Shakespeare was. His 5 favorite plays in Shakespeare. And they are King John. Say that again. Anybody ever seen King John? Anyone read it? Anyone ever hear anyone talk about it? It's not exactly one of the best known ones. It's incredibly obscure. Richard II. Richard III, Hamlet, and the Scottish play. Is there a pattern here? Oh, there's more than one pattern. And the patterns are obvious, but they're very profound for Lincoln. These plays are all about monarchs, rulers. They're all about rulers who come to bad ends, who have to face civil wars and lose them. Think about that. What could Lincoln possibly have learned from studying about civil wars? He learned different things from different monarchs. In Richard II, he will learn about a monarch who makes unwise choices and alienates half the country, but far worse, does not act the way a king is supposed to act. The great Sir Ian McKellen, still thankfully very much with us, one of the greatest Shakespearean actors of the past 50 years, when he was still very young, and you can get extracts of video from this on YouTube, you should look it up. And that is a young Ian McKellen, long before he plays Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, long before he plays Magneto in the X-Men franchise movies, is playing Richard II in the 1970s. And he's chewing an apple sitting on the edge of a table. And all his courtiers are shocked. A king should not act this way. There is a lack of dignity, a lack of dignitas, a lack of weight to it. Now, contrast this with Abraham Lincoln, a man who how do we remember Lincoln? Does he have a beard? Can you imagine Lincoln without his beard? When did he grow the beard? He grew the beard only after being elected president of the United States, when he, in the weeks while he was traveling from Illinois to Washington for his first inaugural. A little boy writes to Lincoln from somewhere in the country and says, "Dear Mr. President, we wish you well, God be with you. Don't you think you would look more presidential if you had a beard?" And that gives Lincoln the idea. But this is a man who all his life has been saturated in Shakespeare. When he is finally president of the United States, when he's not living in the obscurity of Illinois anymore in Springfield, and he's dealing with the terrible crisis of the most terrible crisis the American people and the United States have ever faced in all their long history, in the more than 400 years since the Jamestown settlement, no American leader has faced, even in the nuclear age, the horrors and burdens that Abraham Lincoln faced during the Civil War. And how does he relax? He invites Shakespearean actors, the leading Shakespearean actors in America, to the White House so he can discuss the plays of Shakespeare with them. Now, he is not consciously saying, aha, I must now model myself on this version of kingship in Shakespeare as opposed to that. This is Lincoln. He's much too profound and subtle for that. He's just absorbing it from them. He's absorbing it from them. And incidentally, who kills him? Who is he assassinated by? There is a terrible symmetry to this. John Wilkes Booth, the most famous and popular and revered Shakespearean actor in America. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. A man who has lived in his head in the plays of Shakespeare all his life. But he learns more from Shakespeare than this. He learns the use of rhetoric. This is a man whose three greatest public speeches have become some of the most profound and quoted state documents, not just in American history, but in global history. The first and second inaugural addresses and the Gettysburg Address. Now, Lincoln is a master of the set speech, and he keeps them often surprisingly short. And this is a very Shakespearean thing, and it is a very un-19th century thing. 19th century orators, and this was true at political conventions in the United States all the way through to the 1950s, till television made it obsolete. To be a political orator in America, you had to talk for 2 or 3 hours. I was born too late. I'd have been wonderful at that, right? And of course, they love the Irish at it too. You just, steam it up and you keep going for hour after hour after hour, and nobody afterwards remembers a word you say, but the entertainment is there. But the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural are not like this. They are Shakespearean, not just in content, but in form, in their very nature. One memorable phrase, tight, clear, unshakable, hammered onto another after another, and the whole thing is all over in 15 or 20 minutes. After he gives the Gettysburg Address, the immediate response that day and the following day afterwards is people who were there were not impressed by the Gettysburg Address. There was another professional orator who spoke on the day of Gettysburg and the heroism of the Civil War before Lincoln. He spoke for an hour and a half, where Lincoln spoke for less than 20 minutes, less than 15 minutes, in fact. And everybody agreed that was the great speech. That was what people came to hear. They did not come to hear what Lincoln had to say. And Lincoln had a very unimpressive speaking voice. It was very high pitched. So was George Patton's, by the way. And he squeaked quite a bit. He did not have a dignified, deep, profound speaking voice. One of the reasons Patton revived so dramatically after being forgotten for 25 years was in the movie Patton, he's played by George C. Scott. Anyone here seen the movie? Anyone here not seen the movie, right? Now, you look at George C. Scott, deep, growling voice, macho, strong fellow. George S. Patton looked exactly like and was also a formidable 6'2" tall, but he speaks like this all the time. You'll find if you look even on the Pentagon television channel where they revere Patton, you will never see in American documentaries Patton speaking. It's too embarrassing. He's like a squeaky little hysteric. No, he wasn't. He was a real military genius. I don't mean to take any of this away. It's the opposite. It's the fact that all these profound talents appear in unexpected packages and confound our expectations. In Lincoln's case, the impact of the Gettysburg Address is entirely literary. It is when the Gettysburg Address is printed and appears in the newspapers and people read it and can then reread it, and then they go, oh, holy shit. And they realize that, you know, somebody has just whacked them in the face with a 2x4 carved in the stone of eternity. That's Lincoln's genius. See it in the second inaugural as well. And he gets all of this from Shakespeare. And where did he learn Shakespeare? On the frontier. Now, when I grew up in Britain, and I think this, there was the British popular culture is wonderful. It keeps coming up with wonderful new things and then claiming that the new things were around forever. So you see a Doctor Who, the famous time traveler. And in the show, Doctor Who goes back to 1066 and the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest of England. So everybody therefore assumes that Doctor Who is an English institution that's been around since 1066. You know, when I was at Oxford, men's and women's colleges were strictly segregated. I had to climb in or out of my girlfriend's college over a 15-foot high iron fence with spikes at the top. And when you're young and you're in love, and you're also fortified with slivovitz at the time, you can do anything. And even I managed to do that without getting myself killed or seriously scarred, right? But today, my college and my old girlfriend's college and all the other colleges, both the men and the women, the men's colleges have lots of women students and lady heads and lecturers. And the lady colleges are filled with male students too, right? But because it's Oxford and Cambridge, it's simply assumed it was always this way. And of course, there are lots of Black and Asian students and graduate students and professors and lecturers across the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. But because it's that way today, because this is England, we were always this tolerant. We were always this open. We were always this exclusive. No, we weren't. The changes didn't even come in my time. They came in the 1980s, in the Thatcher era, a decade and more after I'd left. But there is the assumption of back projecting the present onto the past, whereas in fact the past is very different from the present, and that is the most difficult thing for any of us to ever grasp. But one show in Britain goes on forever, and it's called Desert Island Discs. Anyone ever hear of it? I don't know if you ever had it in Canada. It's a beautiful, simple idea. Maybe we should start it for Canada, and you'd be the perfect guy to do it, Matt, because here's what you do. You simply have a half-hour conversation with a friend or one of your colleagues. You could have one with all of us in this room right now in this Zoom seminar, and there's half a year already of interviews. And here is the assumption. You're on a desert island, you ask your guest, what are the 8 favorite pieces of music you will take with you, and explain why each piece of music means a lot to you, and it's a 30-minute show. Isn't that a simple, brilliant, lovely idea? But they don't ask what literature to bring with you. Why? Because they give you 2 pieces of literature to bring with you all along. And those 2 pieces of literature are the King James translation of the Bible, 1612, while Shakespeare or Marlowe is still alive, in the style, in the culture. And the other piece of literature you're allowed to take with you, the collected works of William Shakespeare. What does this mean? It means that the entirety of English literary civilization and theology, and the core of English political thought and liberty and debate, and even scientific conceptual underpinnings, can be put in a handbag and carried with you anywhere in the world or in future centuries throughout the solar system. And when we do achieve, as I believe we have achieved, greater than light speed, or virtually instant passage across the galaxy, because of course space is not a vacuum, as I cannot resist pointing out yet again, Hannes Alphen is right. Space is a plasma. It is an ionized gas plasma, and therefore Newton's original conception, validated by Tesla, of instantaneous travel between points A and B anywhere in the universe, as Ben Rich said before he died, the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works from 1975 to 1993, virtually instantaneous travel, is perfectly conceptually feasible, because space is not a vacuum. So we can go anywhere, but wherever we go, we can bring the heart of the best of Anglo-American democratic civilization with us, because it is embodied in 2 vast corpuses of work which are universally available to this day: the King James translation of the Bible, Old and New Testaments, and the second one is the collected works of William Shakespeare / Kit Marlowe. And where do we find the validation of this? Shakespeare and Marlowe both live in England around 1600, do they not? They're both born in the middle of, in the era of Queen Elizabeth I. And yet 300 years later, at the time of the Civil War, the United States is run by a president who has no higher education whatsoever, but who gained all his moral, he isn't even a Christian, he makes no secret about it, but he takes all his moral, conceptual, and political sensitivities and understandings of human nature from the works of the collected Bible and of William Shakespeare. And he can carry them in a knapsack. He can carry them in a briefcase. It's only 2 books. But unlike 16th century Elizabethan England, mid-19th century America, especially Midwestern America, is a literate society, saturated in the culture of Shakespeare, saturated in the culture of the King James Bible. We see again and again from the testimony of the best friend Lincoln ever had, Joshua Speed, who was his law partner out on the circuit in Springfield in the 1840s and 1850s, that Shakespeare could not be seen without a copy of Shakespeare, no, that Lincoln could not be seen without a copy of Shakespeare with him everywhere. He quotes it everywhere. He quotes it everywhere. And as I said earlier on, what are his 5 favorite plays? They're all tragedies. They are all about nations in civil war. They are all about presidents. Because of course, none of those kings have children who take over the throne after them. That's the other thing they have in common. Well, actually, no, King John does. His baby boy, Henry III, does take over. But John dies unhappily with the whole country rising up in rebellion around him, and that's the least known of them. The whole central theme of the Scottish play is that the king will die without an heir. and that the three wise women gave him an empty throne because another, and he isn't even allowed to enjoy the fruits of that in his own time, because it eats at him that the children of another man will become the kings of Scotland in perpetuity after him. And that's why he's driven to commit first one murder and then multiple murders afterwards. And then the country rises up against him, and he has no conception of how to defeat them. No conception of how to defeat them. By contrast with Lincoln, Lincoln is a winner. Now, Lincoln is a winner in some terrible ways. You know, there's one occasion he goes to front lines at Silver Spring, north of Washington. That's how close the Confederates got. They weren't just south of Washington across the Potomac. They were north of Washington in Silver Spring, Maryland. And Lincoln, who was 6'5" tall with his beard and the stovepipe hat, stands up to take a look at the Confederate positions. And an ordinary Union soldier calls to the President of the United States and says, "Get down, you damn fool, they'll kill you." And he actually dives at the President and knocks him down to save his life. Who was that Union soldier? He becomes a Supreme Court justice. 40 or 50 years on. And please give me the name. I have a mental block, which is embarrassing. It's not Charles Evans Hughes, but it's a very famous and beloved Supreme Court justice.
Are you talking about not Oliver Wendell Holmes?
Yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Oliver Wendell Holmes himself saves Abraham Lincoln's life when Oliver Wendell Holmes is, thank you for bailing me out yet again, Matt, on that one. Now, again, even an Irishman cannot make up that kind of story. That, to me, is what has always fascinated me about history, the extraordinary resonances and ironies that permeate throughout. Hundreds of thousands of genuinely brave but badly trained Union boys in the Army of the Potomac are killed under one commander after another because Lincoln, who was a military illiterate, cannot recognize a winner. And finally, a winner becomes so obvious that even Lincoln cannot ignore him and comes to appreciate him at the end. Above all else, Lincoln is I think the fictional writer who gets Lincoln best is Gore Vidal in his novel, Lincoln. And above all else, ultimately, Lincoln is an experienced politician who's had more than his share of failures. So when he finally locks onto a winner, he doesn't let go. He's wiser than Churchill, who is always trying to get rid of Montgomery and replace him with his own personal favorite, the utterly useless, very handsome and charming and personally decent and nice and kind, but militarily useless, Sir Harold Alexander, Field Marshal Alexander. But Churchill is blind to how much Montgomery has saved him and how much he owes Montgomery. Lincoln learns better about Grant. And of course, they have a lot in common because they're both guys from the American heartland. Grant is from Ohio, and so powerful is Grant's impact that half a dozen more presidents from Ohio follow him all the way through to Warren G. Harding in the next half century after Lincoln's death. And Grant is an enormously underestimated general. And I would maintain an enormously underestimated president as well. And Matt and I have already discussed, if you can put up with it on some future occasion, I very much would like to give a presentation to raise up Grant. The interesting thing is, Grant in his own lifetime is revered. He ranks even higher than Lincoln as the savior of the Union. His funeral, take a look at the photographs of his funeral when he dies in 1886. 3 million people turn out on the streets of New York City. In 1886, for the funeral of Grant. After Grant dies, the Southern cause is rehabilitated in America. And Grant is a new myth develops, which lasts 80 years, well into the 1960s. That Robert E. Lee is the gallant cavalier. We forget that he's defending slavery and segregation in a virtually genocidal cause. And also that above all else, Lee is a loser. After Stonewall Jackson is a true military genius. But after he dies, Lee loses his magic right arm. It's never the same. And the parallel I would draw with you here is the famous contest in the Desert War in 1942 between Montgomery and Rommel. The German general Rommel, who Churchill admired, dashing, handsome, really a cavalryman riding tanks instead of horses, but it's the same idea, running rings around the British, winning battles against impossible odds, being an old-fashioned gentleman, even though he's defending an absolutely monstrous cause. And then there is Montgomery, the professional, who his rivals falsely accused of being slow and a plodder, which actually is totally false. I mean, the accusation is mainly made by the staff of Eisenhower and Eisenhower himself, and Eisenhower is the most useless plodder of the lot. And Eisenhower, in fact, is despised as a combat general, not just by Montgomery, but by the best American combat generals. Bradley, MacArthur, Patton himself, they all come to despise Eisenhower as a combat general with withering contempt. But Eisenhower is a political genius. Like Churchill and Lincoln, he's very poor at direct combat direction, but he's very good at taking the praise, that belongs to other people and managing to shunt the blame that really belongs to him onto other people. When we deify Lincoln, we have reason to deify Lincoln, but we also have to remember the price of Lincoln's achievement. The price of Lincoln's achievement at saving the Union is a combined death toll that is now put demographically at 850 to 870,000 people in a population of only 30 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of 10 million human beings dying in a war today. Even in absolute terms, it is greater than the death tolls of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all the wars we have fought since 2001, since 9/11 combined, by far. And if you factor it in as a percentage of the population, it's inconceivably high. It's comparable then to the Russian death toll in World War II, and it's self-inflicted. And it's virtually all white guys, even though the war is fought to end slavery. It's Northerners and Southerners killing each other. And Lee is not remotely as good a general as he's supposed to be, but in the Eastern theater of the war, where the main bloodbaths are fought, Lincoln appoints one butcher and inept loser after another. The best he can come up with is General Meade. And General Meade is really an exact parallel to Sir Douglas Haig on the Western Front in World War I. He always manages to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. He's just tough enough and mean enough and ruthless enough to hold the war together until the other side has bled. But the real war is won, of course, in the Western theater by both Grant and Sherman. Now, today you have Victor Davis Hanson, a neocon historian, who's a very sweet, nice guy, but always strikes me as an asshole, basically as an innocent Boy Scout, in which everything happens for the good and the best, and we are always the best, most pure, and most virtuous people. And it's sweet, and I wish it was true, but it isn't. And he tries to claim, well, Sherman won all the Civil War without having to fight battle by wars of maneuver, and Grant was really a butcher too. Two answers to that. First, Sherman was only free to maneuver because Grant held Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia down for the last bloody year of the war in one battle after another and didn't allow them to cut loose and wreak havoc anywhere else. So he nailed them down there and allowed Sherman to finish his own job of conquering the West. Secondly, obscurely, and very strangely, and we go back immediately to wind up on Lincoln after this, but on the issue of Grant, today we find Grant's reputation is rising again, but there are two kinds of historians, very unlikely in both cases, you might assume, who are reviving Grant's reputation. First is a tradition of Black lady African-American historians in the US who point out that Grant was the one American president who truly defeated and destroyed the Ku Klux Klan. who was not afraid of it, who smashed it so thoroughly that it did not dare raise its ugly head again behind those diabolical white hats for another half a century, until the time of Woodrow Wilson and after World War I. And Grant did not fool around about this. Grant, even as president, was a much more powerful and effective and figure for decency than he is given credit for. As Matt and I have discussed on many occasions, Grant, while he is president, upholds and defends and preserves democracy in Mexico, when the French, backed by the British, are trying to impose an imperial dictatorship on Mexico that the city of London can bleed the country dry through under the Austrian Emperor Maximilian. And it's only when Grant is a lame duck and leaving office in 1876 that another British pawn, President Porfirio Diaz, is able to seize power and destroy President Benito Juarez's democratic traditions in Mexico. And for the next 35 years, from 1876 to 1911, Mexico enters the darkest period of its modern history, when life expectancy falls from age 50 to age 30, an era of literally genocidal repression. In one rebellion in a single Mexican province in 1890, 600,000 people, almost all of the mestizos, native peoples, men, women, and children, are all slaughtered by the federales. Now, the horror that we do remember in the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 is a direct consequence of this very dark era, the Porfirista. And as long as Lincoln and Lincoln's true heir, Grant, are in the White House with real power in the North American continent, these dark forces are driven out of Mexico. It's only when they are pulled out, when the infamous Compromise of 1877 is made, whereby the South agrees to accept a fixed stolen election so that Rutherford Hayes can go into the White House. And in return, Hayes abandons the tradition of both Grant and Lincoln and pulls federal forces out of the South and leaves the newly liberated and inexperienced former Black slaves unprotected against white racist supremacist vengeance that the true dark age for the next 80 years is imposed across the American South. And this is a tradition which African Americans in Congress and in scholarship openly teach about. I recommend to you the work of my friend, Professor Gerald Horne, Professor of African American History at the University of Houston. In fact, Matt, you might want to contact Professor Horne. I think he would welcome the chance of being able to speak to a sympathetic graduate level group, especially north of the border. I think a great opportunity for both you guys and such forces. But in Lincoln's case, again, we have the assassination in 1865, and this raises Lincoln to a very ironically mythical level in America, because Lincoln now becomes the fulfillment of something that he predicted 26 years earlier. And I'm really ending with my beginning, because I skipped this at the beginning of the presentation. But there was it's a comment on when we look at major world figures like Churchill and Lincoln, how easily it is, even for the most serious among us, the best read among us, to fall into cliche. And very often a historian will come along who will completely transform everything. And you read what he or she has to say and you think, my God, that should have been staring me in the face. Why didn't I think of that before? Just in passing, I'll mention a couple of more such people who I think the world, I recommend the writing very strongly of. Professor Susan Butler, who wrote Roosevelt and Stalin, which, the cliche for the last 75 years has been one said by Winston Churchill, slandering President Franklin Roosevelt, a dead man who could not clear his own name and could not fight back. And Churchill accuses Roosevelt of being morally obtuse and childishly naive about the evil threat of Stalin. And that's just a lie. It's absurd. It's not true. Roosevelt, from a position of strength, nevertheless won Stalin's respect, and to the degree that any human being was capable of doing so, even a level of trust. And this has proved crucial to maintaining the peace of the world in the past 75 years, because that residue of trust with even a paranoid psychopath, which Stalin was, And FDR was still able to reach a level of trust and honorable dealing with him from a position of strength. FDR was not the naive, childish figure. Of course, Freud comes into this because Churchill is projecting. Churchill is projecting his own inadequacies onto an innocent man who did not share those inadequacies. It's contemptible behavior, very common in human condition. We see it in history too. Churchill himself was inadequate in ways he falsely accused Franklin Roosevelt of being. But that, now, reversing that polarity to Lincoln. Lincoln, there's one aspect of Lincoln I have to touch on before we close. And this is something that two authors in particular have brought up. The late Thomas Strauss wrote a wonderful book called Generations, an enormous, nearly 700-page history of the United States from 1588 to the 21st century. It was published in the 1980s. How can you write a history that goes on for 30 years after you've finished it? Because he's talking about the different generations that shaped American destiny from the time they were born to the time they died, and how each generation is different and shapes America or any country in its own image. And he places Lincoln very much in the tradition of a most revered intellectual generation in America, but which Thomas Strauss reinterprets as a terrifying generation. They are the transcendentalists, the generation of Emerson, the generation of profound intellectuals who despise material progress, but who look for the United States as forming a new heaven on earth. That we must reform American society and the very nature of humanity within America. And Emerson is in this generation, but who else is in this generation? Lincoln, Jefferson Davis is in this generation, the president of the Confederacy, and so is Robert E. Lee himself. The kindly, gentlemanly, polite champion of slavery, who was relentlessly ruthless in slaughtering hundreds of thousands of Yankee soldiers. But what they all have in common is, and Lincoln has this too, that ideas are more important than human suffering. There is a speech that Lincoln gives. It's not widely quoted or known. I discuss it at quite a bit of length in my book, Cycles of Change. But you can find it based in a book by a man I don't even like personally, but he is a serious fellow. And he's a champion of American imperialism, Robert Kaplan, in his book, An Empire Wilderness, about the American West. Now, this is very useful for you, Matt, because the very title indicates something that you and your wife tackle that nobody else, I believe, has ever tackled before you. And that is, why is America still a wilderness when it appeared to be filling up fast in the 19th century? You have pointed out the forces that pull back from this. Kaplan, as a good neocon imperialist, doesn't ask any such awkward questions. But he's bright enough and alert enough to see that what the end result is, that there is a wilderness. But he has a great quote from Lincoln in there. And it is this: Lincoln justifies the fearful suffering of the Civil War this way, that the unhappiness and clouds of today will be but a passing thing. And our sadness of today will be smothered by the everlasting reality of an America dedicated to freedom that goes from sea to shining sea. I paraphrase slightly, you will find the exact quote there in Lincoln's own incomparable prose. But Kaplan then rightly asks this question: my God, what is this man saying? He is saying that we have lost 400,000 dead and are going to lose even more in the rest of this terrible war. But all the suffering this causes is going to pass, because the people who feel the losses are going to die too. The memory of the war, of the sufferings of the war, will pass when all those people whose hearts were broken by the deaths of so many loved ones in the war, they'll die too. But what then will last beyond them? America, a powerful world power bound by steel and railroads and internal free trade from one ocean to another to fulfill the image of freedom in a modern technological world. Now, typical of Lincoln, there is both great good and vision and great evil mixed up in here together. There is both. But who could think in these terms? Who could say we have lost hundreds of thousands of dead boys, every one of them a shattered, broken home? But it doesn't matter. It won't matter, because everybody who grieves them, they'll never get over their grief. But then they'll die. But what won't die? The United States of America won't die as a vast, unified geopolitical reality. And even Kaplan, who goes on from this to become to this day a mindless champion of American idiot imperialism around the world. You know, he really signed on to the global war on terror, which is basically a global war on everything. Right? And it's meaningless, lacks definition. But even Kaplan is horrified by this. And he says, my God, this is a terrifying man. What is he saying? A sobering point to end on. Again, it does bring home the point that just as there is endless depth in Shakespeare, an endless understanding of the depths of human depravity and horror and nobility in the works of Shakespeare. No surprise then that we find that we go full circle, that the most profound student of Shakespeare in modern political history is also one of America's greatest and most important presidents and men of destiny, and that the only serious political, intellectual education he ever got was through the works of William Shakespeare, and it stood him in very good stead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you very much. And indeed, I think that a follow-up sequel to this gestalt that you shared with us would indeed be the Ulysses S. Grant homage that I don't think has been properly treated justly in a very long time. So certainly let's discuss that shortly about the coming weeks.
Very happy to. Absolutely, Matt.
Wonderful. If we have a little bit of time, about 30 minutes or so for Q&A. So if anybody has a question, feel free to just speak it out loud. Usually we do the names in the chat box, but we could skip that this time around if people would like. So I'll just leave the stage to everyone out there. We got Stephen. I knew Stephen would have something.
I hoped you would, man. I prayed for it.
Marty, thanks for a brilliant lecture. I loved it. I really enjoyed it. If I can, and I'll refrain from being an Irish rascal and ask you about the Israeli honeypot as a dating strategy if I wanted to become a despot, just to have a hope of something in the future. But yeah, we'll let that go. My question actually goes back, it's a bit of a tangent, but it goes back to the Shakespeare-Marlowe influence. Is there any evidence of the influences on Marlowe in terms of the intelligence apparatus within London and Britain? For example, possibly John Dee or someone else. I'm just wondering if we can go back and skip one in terms of the influence on Lincoln and just see where it originates from or how far back that actually goes.
In terms of Marlowe / Shakespeare, the documentation here is very strong and straightforward, because in Britain there is Marlowe and Shakespeare are separated to a psychotic degree. It is impossible. I had a love affair for 3 years with a girl when I was at university who got a first in English literature from Oxford, and to her, this would be typical of my contemptible Irish wild irreverence to even begin to imagine that Shakespeare and Marlowe could be the same person, because these people are so deeply ingrained in their own reflex fantasy, reverse fantasies. What they believe is truth, there is no evidence for. But what we do find is that the scholarship in Christopher Marlowe, up to his presumed death in the Tavern of Deptford in 1593, is very strong and very thorough. And there is no question. I will cite you a couple of books on this. You might start with The Man Who Was Shakespeare by Calvin Hoffman, which came out back in 1955. There is one by a wonderful lady from North Carolina who I would have loved to have met. She died about eight years before I even knew she had ever existed. And she basically traces Marlowe's apparently after-death life. He remained eminent in British diplomatic circles, which were very small, of course, at the time. But we find this documented very closely. There is a book called The School of Night, and the English mystical magical circles around the Queen. Marlowe is in this. He isn't the founder of it. Walsingham is in it. He is very close to Walsingham personally. Some extraordinary people are in this. Marlowe Shakespeare may well have known Giordano Bruno personally, because Giordano Bruno lives in England from 1584 to 1586 and is working for the Secret Service to Francis Walsingham. Walsingham's son-in-law, Sir Philip Sidney, who dies in the Netherlands in 1587 fighting the Spanish, is Marlowe's closest friend. There are documentary-style outstanding novels about not Shakespeare or Marlowe, but about Bruno that I recommend to you, by a wonderful lady English writer called Stephanie, I forget her, she goes under, her writing name is S.J. Paris, P-A-R-R-I-S. There's a series so far of 6 or 7 Marlowe novels. Just as detective novels or historical novels set in England, they are outstanding. But basically in each one, Giordano Bruno is a classical English detective. He solves a murder. It's splicing together historical fiction, detective novels, and speculation about all these people. And John Dee plays roles in these books too. But it is known that it is very clear that Marlowe was involved in Dee's circle. The school was called the School of Night. And another member of the circle was Sir Walter Raleigh. And Marlowe hates Raleigh, and clearly Shakespeare does too, because Marlowe, Walter Raleigh is very clearly the model for Malvolio in Twelfth Night. The courtier who makes a fool of himself flattering the great lady to a ludicrous and obsequious degree was exactly the way Raleigh presented himself to Queen Elizabeth I. And Shakespeare, Marlowe makes fun of him here, just as in Hamlet. What's the girlfriend's dad? The old guy, geezer, who's the king's minister in Hamlet. Not Claudius, but you know who I mean. He's the father of
Ophelia.
Yes, Ophelia's dad, right? Ophelia's dad is clearly modeled on Lord Burleigh, who is the Lord Chancellor of England. Now, as long as Francis Walsingham stays alive, his James Bond, his ace agent, who is Marlowe, can do what he wants with impunity. But Marlowe, being so literate and brilliant and proud and arrogant and young, shoots his head off. And Raleigh and other senior people who are jealous of him and hate him, and no doubt have other reasons too as well, line him up on charges of alleging that he is both homosexual and is also doesn't believe in Christianity, and also has been involved in magical, mystical rites. And all of these accusations, quote unquote, are perfectly true and can easily be proven, which is why Marlowe has to fake his own death, but does so with clearly with the protection of the Secret Service by doing so, because he continues to from overseas to flourish for at least another 25 years or more. Now, there are different books that one can, as I say, the stuff on Marlowe after he supposedly dies at the Deptford Tavern in 1593 is much more speculative, obviously. But the documentation on Marlowe as a secret agent of the Queen, as being so powerful that he is away from Cambridge University so much during his undergraduate years and is so distrusted by the academics at Cambridge University, they do not want to give him his degree. And yet Marlowe, who was only 22 years old or so at the time, no, 23, it's 1586, is able to get the Lord Chancellor of England himself, Lord Burleigh, to make a commandment to the University of Cambridge and say, you will give this young man a degree. He has been absent from university on matters absolutely essential to the survival of the state and the security of Her Majesty. What kind of fellow, not from an aristocratic background, from such a humble background, lucky to get into Cambridge University at all, can humiliate his own college, can humiliate the leaders of the university, of one of the two premier universities in England? What kind of standing can he have in the deep state to be able to enforce that kind of power at the age of 22? And for that matter, we now know, and I pointed out this before, we now know exactly what Marlowe looked like. We have a portrait of him, which was only discovered by accident at Trinity College, his old college in, no, at Christ Church, I think it was, but certainly his old college in Cambridge in 1953. This is discussed in Hoffman's book for the first time in 1955. And I can send you or anyone else who's interested links on this as well. What did Marlowe look like? He was William Shakespeare. If you look at the image, you already know this, Stephen, of course, because we've discussed this and I see it in your face. But if you don't even need FBI facial software for this, although I can assure you it works. I have friends in the agency and they've run it for me. If you take the image of Marlowe, which we only have since 1953, but which is indisputably identified as Marlowe, as a young man at university, red-haired, sharp chin, little pointy beard, the oval features, unmistakable. And then you look at the most famous, one of the most famous images in the world, which is the face of William Shakespeare on the first folio of 1623. And by the way, since our Shakespeare died in 1616, why did the posthumous collection of the collected works only come out 7 years later, in 1623? Unless the Shakespeare who died in Stratford, indisputably, in 1616, was not the author of the plays. On the conventional model, the life of Shakespeare and the history of Shakespeare do not make sense. They are not coherent. In 1593, the very first long classic poem by William Shakespeare appears, and it's already a mature masterpiece. And many literary scholars have discussed the mystery of the fact that there's no warm-up period, there's no wind-up like a pitcher in baseball, but every significant literary writer has a warm-up period. Even somebody who's a genius at the age of 20, 21, like John Keats, you can see him zooming up there in his teenage efforts. But we have nothing whatsoever from Shakespeare. What we do have is the work of Marlowe. And not only is Marlowe's, the key point of Marlowe's work is it fits Shakespeare's perfectly. The love poetry, the style is similar. Recent scholarship has proven beyond any shadow of doubt that Shakespeare was a plagiarist. Who did he plagiarize? He plagiarized Marlowe. There are huge chunks in the plays and the poems of Shakespeare that are lifted straight from previous works by Marlowe. But of course, if Marlowe was Shakespeare, he wasn't stealing from anybody else. He was only doing what I've done for the past 20 years. He was plagiarizing from himself. He was quoting his own previous works, and yet it is all there. Finally, and most crucially in this area, and it's quite extraordinary, Shakespeare pioneers a form of massive 5-act historical dramas in which he doesn't have to bother about making a plot. He can mass produce these plays very quickly because he simply uses Holinshed's chronicles and the records of the kings of England over the previous, 400 years since the time of King John. And he requotes them. He recycles them in his own marvelous poetry, right? These are the great historical cycles. This is what Lincoln loved. These are the meditations on leadership that we see throughout Shakespeare, right? The great historical cycle plays. There is only one individual in English history, English literature, who had the same interests, and that was Marlowe. When you look at Tamerlane, the work that he wrote before that, even other things that come in. You look at The Merchant of Venice. Shylock breaks your heart because Shakespeare is the writer of Merchant of Venice is such a genius that that Shylock bleeds. But Shylock is still the villain. He still wants to cut out the heart of Antonio. The crowd-pleasing scene in The Merchant of Venice is that the tables are turned and Shylock gets thrown in jail or stripped of all his obscene wealth, which because he's a Jew, he should never have had in the first place anyway, right? Conveniently in a plot. But what do we find from Marlowe? We find the most anti-Semitic play and a piece of literature in English history. We find The Jew of Malta. Now, in The Jew of Malta, Shylock at least has his heart broken because his daughter is too virtuous for him. She becomes a Christian. But the Jew of Malta has the last laugh. He's such a villain that he poisons an entire convent of nuns because his own daughter has converted to Christianity and joined them. And she dies too, and he's very happy about this. In other words, the Jew of Malta is an anti-Semitic caricature that Hitler and Julius Streicher would have been proud of. But the man who wrote both these plays, you can see one play leads to the next. And there was the historical drama here that fits as well. There was both Marlowe and Shakespeare, and this comes back to Lincoln and the conceptions of leadership, write plays about kings who are gay, who are homosexual, and therefore in the mores of those times must be seen as contemptible and must have hideous deaths. And Shakespeare's famous version of this is Richard II, as I mentioned before. A king who actually means well but is feckless, who has no deep conception of justice, unlike his arch enemy John of Galt at the same time, and therefore deserves eventually to come to a hideous end at the hands of John Galt's son, Henry IV, right? But again, this is a more mature, nuanced, just as the creator of The Jew of Malta becomes embarrassed by the crude, poisonous caricature he has made, and he makes another villain Jew, and it's still a villain. He still is anti-Semitic, but it's an anti-Semite who is human and is in a way sympathetic, or at least understandable and plausible. The same man who made The Jew of Malta makes The Merchant of Venice.
Marty,
that's the central thing. Yeah.
If I could ask a question.
Oh, please.
To my understanding, most of Shakespeare's tragedies were in the beginning, and somewhere something happened, and he wrote the comedies later. Is that correct?
No. I mean,
no?
He overlaps with the comedy. He's already writing the comedies under Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, he was right. So he was writing the comedies in the beginning?
No, he mixes
before he wrote the tragedies.
No, he mixes them. You can't divide the two. He mixes them. He does both. He will go from one to another. And in fact,
okay, so it wasn't there.
No, and in fact, there's a wonderful in-joke on this, and it's a delightful movie, again, completely wrong conceptually, but it's acted and produced utterly delightfully, and that is Shakespeare in Love from about 1593. I think, if I remember, the great actress, mental block on her name, the lady who played M in the Bond movies, anyway, who plays Queen Elizabeth in this movie. And thank you, Matt, you're bailing me out as usual, yet again. But Shakespeare has made, quote unquote, Romeo and Juliet, right?
Judi Dench.
Judi Dench, perfect, exactly, the great Judi Dench, right? And she plays the queen, and of course, if you meet Judi Dench in person, she's a tiny, petite, sweet, charming, even rather shy little lady. She's only about 5'1", 5'2". And yet when you watch her on screen or see her on stage, the intelligence, the force of personality that comes storming out of her, it's just breathtaking. It's absolutely fabulous. And actually, one other wonderful modern actress who I mentioned here, again, as proof how Shakespeare transcends his English background, how he speaks to the whole world. There's this wonderful actress who I first discovered in Doctor Who. She's Nigerian Jewish in Britain, called Sophie and I've misspelled and mispronounced this. I apologize. You can look her up easily. Okajeno, and she's one of the leading Shakespearean actresses in Britain today. Now, she's Jewish. She lives in Stamford Hill in London. She's black. She's about 5'1" or 5'2" tall. When you hear her speak in her natural voice, it's like she's never left North London in her life, right? And she plays Queen Anne in the BBC television version of the later historical plays of the War of the Roses that came out a couple of years ago. Now, anything more absurd than a 5'1" tall black Queen of England in the 15th century ought to be impossible, right? It flies in the face of every cliche. But because Shakespeare and Marlowe's genius is so great and the writing is so good, and because Sophie Okajeno is a genius, because she's such a wonder, and again, you see her in person, and she's a nice, sweet, charming, obviously intelligent, literate, delightful little lady. But in her private life, doesn't appear to be any hint of the force of personality and imperial power she's easily capable of presenting with. Look at Judi Dench, 5'1" tall. She was already in her 50s when the James Bond movies were made. And what kind of lady can boss James Bond around? Can boss around Daniel Craig or Pierre Brosnan, right? No problem. No problem. But of course, also, this is why and how the British conquered the world and held it for 300 or 400 years. Because British culture and writing and thought can generate this kind of talent. And in a way, we're all of us here, whatever our background, exactly, we're all of us from this. One last point, I love this one. I mean, because this is how Shakespeare is not, or Marlowe, are not even limited in time and space. In the Star Trek series, especially the Last Generation TV shows, which were made from the 1985 to 1992. And in a movie, of course, a Klingon villain played again by a great Canadian I mentioned before, Christopher Plummer. In Star Trek VI, which comes out just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Klingons make peace with the Federation at long last, right? As incidentally was predicted in the very first season of the first Star Trek, in an episode back in 1965. They followed it through. But what we find about the Klingons is they are obsessed with Shakespeare, and they quote him all the time. But like the Russians, they claim Shakespeare isn't really English, he's ours. He was a Klingon, and he was a Klingon who secretly settled in England in the 16th century. Or the evil Americans, stole Shakespeare from us Klingons and created the false story that he was really a human all along, right? So where do you cut the circle? Where do you start from? Where do you unravel the truth? Because this kind of thing can continue and continue. There's no end to it. But to add to it, in the movie Star Trek, the Unexplored Country, I think the one they call it, the one where they have the Klingons, there is a Klingon villain. And he is played, William Shatner, of course, is Canadian by birth. And the villain is played by one of his oldest friends and mentors, who's just died this year, Christopher Plummer, one of the finest stage and movie actors in Canadian history. And of course, Plummer eagerly quotes from Shakespeare all the time, because the Klingon character he is playing identifies himself as a Shakespearean villain, like Richard III, fully self-aware.
William Shatner did study also at Stratford in Ontario.
I know.
Performing in Measure for Measure and other things, but he's one of the few who didn't take the subtleties of Shakespeare with him for the rest of his career. But he's still a fun guy.
Oh, he's a wonderful guy. But I must say, there is one movie where he is that subtle.
No.
Before he becomes Captain Kirk, in 1961, the earnest American liberal Stanley Kramer makes.
Oh, Judgment at Nuremberg.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the wonderful Australian British critic Clive James says about that movie that it's so inept and so well-meaning and so badly done that it takes 4 hours to convince you that the Nazis were bad because they were rude to Judy Garland. And Spencer Tracy is the supposed hero in the movie. And he's a total phony, a boring jerk. I mean, in real life, he was a very inadequate, abusive drunkard, a very unpleasant person in every way, who Katharine Hepburn, far from being in love with, despised. But, you know, the myth of their love affair was very good for both their careers. So, you know, it lasted decades. But in the movie, he's overacting as a ham actor throughout. And the guy who steals every scene from him is the young, cynical American army captain who's already become cynical in occupied Germany and knows the price of everybody and everything, played by William Shatner. And in that movie, Shatner doesn't go over the top, as he already does in The Twilight Zone, even before he goes into Star Trek. His performance is beautifully restrained, cynical, controlled, precise. Everything we don't think of Bill Shatner, bless him, as being. I ought to add here a confession. My wife humiliated me a month ago when she said, "No, I will not let you spend $1,500 to have dinner with William Shatner on his 90th birthday." A pity. I mean, we did spend that level of money taking our kids to a Rolling Stone concert a couple of months ago, and I haven't regretted the cent of it, right? But I do think having dinner with Captain Kirk would be up there too.
Is that what he was charging? I don't want to deflect this, but was he charging $1,500 for a meal?
Oh, yes.
That's actually not a bad deal.
It's all we're freewheeling. Go ahead. Absolutely. Yes, indeed he was.
All right. As a quick segue or side note, since we've put a lot of weight on the issue of Shakespeare and Marlowe, I'm going to put in the description box of this video the link to your previous class, developing that thesis, with the imagery of both portraits as well. So anybody
definitely
on YouTube can go and watch this afterwards. Do we have any parting thoughts, or we have time for one or maybe two, probably one more question? So if anybody has one pressing, now's the time. I think you've given.
I just have one.
Oh, all right, Jerry, go for it.
Okay. Thanks, Marty. That was a great class. I loved it as much as the last one you did on Marlowe and Shakespeare. Just question a different kind, but like I studied Shakespeare under Dr. Frederick Wills many years ago. But at that time, we also did a study of his sonnets. And I just wondered if you have any comment on his sonnets, or if you've read them, or just whatever you think of them.
Philip K. Dick, I'm pre-associating it all over the place, made the wonderful story, "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?" And it becomes the movie Blade Runner with Harrison Ford, science fiction masterpiece. And what Philip K. Dick, the American Kafka, a genius, another genius, brings out there is a central role that Matt and Cynthia always emphasize: the crucial importance of culture and poetry and self-awareness in moral humanity. Something I sneered at, I think, to my lifelong embarrassment, half a century ago and more when I was at university. But it's true. And Dick's thesis is that you can make androids, artificial humans, so flawless it is impossible to tell them apart from human beings physically by any test whatsoever. The only way you can do it is by applying emotional, psychological, and literary tests to them. Now, by this definition, what Dick is looking at is in the world of increasing artificial intelligence, which I share with Matt. I think it's an enormous danger, huge, vast conceptual danger, and much more imminent to us than virtually anybody who doesn't follow these things realizes. But the importance of the human. And the human is not defined even in the narrowest of human senses. By the way, a book I recommend on this is The Chrysalids by the great British science fiction writer John Wyndham, in which there are serious discussions of what is the image of humanity. Is the image of humanity genetic racial pureness? No, it is not. Is it that we all have to have two eyes or two arms, a purely physical image. No, we can evolve beyond that too. It is something in the soul. It is the spiritual. It is this genuine spiritual dimension in humanity. And what we find is Shakespeare, Marlowe, and the great writers and poets awaken this in us. And nowhere, I haven't forgotten what you said, Jerry. The sonnets are, even by Marlowe Shakespeare standards, when you read the sonnets, you are translated to a new level of humanity. They're central to the expression of love. I would recommend to you the sonnets 135 to 139, especially on where Shakespeare Marlowe is teasing with his audience. He's playing games with us because he's saying, you know, am I just will? No, I am not will. But if your will be, then that will shall I be. He's playing with his own identity. He's saying, I am not William Shakespeare. I am not Will. I am not William. But you can't see what's behind the mask. And it's there. And the word games are there. And also the ciphers are there. If you bear with me a moment, a book I'll recommend on Marlovian cipher. Hold on. It should be over here. Ah, yes.
It's going into the treasure vault.
Again, the late great Roberta Ballantyne.
Could you lift that up?
Marlowe up close with a scrapbook of his ciphers. My point is, it isn't just Marlowe who plays cipher games. You find them throughout the sonnets. And you also find in the sonnets something you find in the English, in the Hebrew Bible and in many of the Psalms, and that is each line. Again, I have a mental block, and this has been too long since I had my morning coffee, and I haven't yet had my first evening scotch. But acrostics, you know, when you have the first lines, A, B, C, D, or making names. And we have one extraordinary piece of wordplay that way in the King James Version translation of the Book of Psalms. The King James Bible comes out around 1609, 1610. Marlowe, like Shakespeare, the historical Shakespeare, they're both born 1563, 1564, right? So they would both be around age 46 when the King James Bible comes out. There have long been rumors and speculations that the language of the King James translation is so beautiful and so well done that Shakespeare, as the preeminent playwright and literary figure in England at the time, might have been consulted on it. Nobody's ever proven anything else, but it's a speculation, right? But what we do find, and again, do not take my word from it, look it up. King James Version only, Psalm 46. 46th word from the beginning of the psalm, shake. 46th word from the end of the psalm, spear. Now, like as the Bible code proved, if you have, if you make your computer codes or speculations broad enough and irrelevant enough, you can fantasize or quote unquote prove anything. It ultimately becomes a Rorschach blot. It's meaningless. And you can't hang any major conclusion on this. But remember, first of all, the sonnets are playful. They are written with fun, and they are written with codes, and they are written with ciphers.
What was the significance of 46?
That's how old Marlowe would have been at the time the King James Version was published. Putting his own little mark in there.
So are you inferring that Marlowe wrote or translated the King James Bible? Is that what you're inferring? I mean, Marlowe, Shakespeare.
Not the whole thing, but that he was an editorial influence and had impact on it. Yes, I am.
Hmm.
And this actually fits with another speculation which Rebecca Ballantyne and others before her have made, which is that he was personally responsible for the first English translation of Don Quixote. And she goes further because the figure who Marlowe may have become until his death in 1622, 1623, was at first secretary at the British Embassy, English Embassy in Venice at the time, whose wife was the former mistress of Miguel Cervantes, and who boasted to her friends that she was now married to a much greater poet than Cervantes, to the greatest poet in the world. Which, of course, again, proves absolutely nothing. It really does not. And you'd have to verify the sources of the quotations as well, which I have not yet done. But it's worth looking into and worth holding in reserve.
Mm-hmm. And that it creates another anomaly, I think, that you've addressed months ago, was the relationship between, or the similarity of the lives of Cervantes and Shakespeare, who died on the exact same day. And Cervantes as well was also a playwright, that he's not so well known for that, but all of his plays have been lost. But his plays undoubtedly also carried certain nuanced political insights, just like his Don Quixote did. So that there's something interesting there that has to be, I guess, researched and followed up on by serious scholars, which I've never seen done. Do you have any thoughts on that? On the relationship between Cervantes and Shakespeare in more detail?
Myself?
Yeah.
The answer is no, but not because I'm skeptical. I'm actually very open to it. I've seen comments on this over the years that I did not follow up on. And again, Ballantyne, who died a few years ago, is very gung-ho on it. And for anyone who follows up on her work, she has very extensive scholarly apparatus and bibliography. So there are definitely roads to explore on that one. And I think I would be strongly optimistic in that area. One other thing we have to bear in mind, and this again is a contrast between Lincoln's world and Shakespeare Cervantes' world. In Lincoln's world, we underestimate how literate Europe and North America were in the 19th century, even before industrialization. How widely read people were, how widely read Shakespeare's works circulated, how it wasn't easy, but it was entirely conceptually feasible for a man with Lincoln's extraordinary intellect to have that lifelong deep access. And by the way, one thing, actually, if I may, one point more, 1839, I mentioned this a couple of times, I have not gone into it. It is the earliest major address we have from Lincoln. It was totally lost for 100 years until the great American critic Edmund Wilson rediscovered it in 1939, published in New York intellectual journals, I think in the New Yorker, but I stand to be corrected on that one, maybe in the Atlantic. But it created a sensation. Lincoln at the age of 28, never been to college, right? A self-taught little jumped up self-proclaimed lawyer, only because he calls himself one, not little, because he's hugely tall, gives an address at the equivalent of the Kiwanis Club or the local Lions, just a local sorority in the town of Springfield, right? And it's just a dining club for young self-important little fellows who will be the aspiring middle class of a middle class that will not emerge for another 50 or 70 years yet, right? And it's recorded, it's kept in the archives there. And what does he say? He's talking about the coming civil war in America over the divisions between black and white. And he's saying that America is so vast, so far from the world, so mighty already, that it cannot be conquered by an outside force. But the greatest dangers to America are within. First of all, the threat of disintegration and civil war over the race issue. But he says there is a much greater danger than that. Lincoln says, 28 years old, the greatest danger we have is we have the most perfect political system humanity has ever come up with, a republic that is shown it is stable, it is self-renewing, it protects liberty, it protects property, it protects dignified human rights, but it does not protect us against our own human natures. because eventually there will appear, Lincoln says. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing here, but look it up. You'll see. I sent you all the links, the documentation. There will appear, Lincoln says, geniuses who see themselves as Alexander, as Napoleon, as Caesar. You see, by the way, the influence here of Shakespeare again, who writes precisely about such heroic figures, right? And what does Lincoln channeling Shakespeare say about these people? Such people do not want to become the president of a bank, or the chairman of a board, or the mayor of a city, or the governor of a state, or even president of the United States for 1 or 2 terms and follow in the paths of George Washington or Andrew Jackson or Thomas Jefferson. For towering genius disdains at such things. They will want to recast America in totally new forms. And how will they do this? They will turn faction against faction, and they will transform our nature. Why, they may even free the slaves as a tool for their own absolute power. You can read this as an unconscious interpretation of Lincoln prophesying his own future. He suspends habeas corpus. He, a lawyer, maintains control of the state of Maryland, which is a slave-owning state which wants to be part of the Confederacy. But if it succeeds, then what? The city of Washington is lost, and automatically there is no doubt that the 2 most powerful nations in the world, England and France, will recognize the slave-owning Confederacy. So how does Lincoln prevent this? He suspends habeas corpus, and he imposes a medial martial law, and he occupies the state of Maryland and also the state of Kentucky with federal troops. He breaks the Constitution of the United States. He breaks every safeguard to liberty in the Bill of Rights. He knows he is eligible to be impeached immediately. What did we impeach Bill Clinton over? For lying that he hadn't had intimate relations with his girlfriend, who wasn't even a serious girlfriend at the time, and he is impeached for that. The 2 impeachments of Donald Trump were over jokes. George W. Bush is not impeached, even though he puts America into 2 full-scale unending wars for 20 years on totally fraudulent grounds, though he was probably too dumb to realize it at the time. We are afraid of using the impeaching tool today in any serious, responsible way, so the impeachment tool has become a joke. But what is Lincoln's response to the impeachment tool? He says it doesn't matter, because if we lose, we're going down anyway. And if we win, I'll simply appoint reliable justices on the Supreme Court, which is exactly what he does, to retroactively confirm my actions. Now, again, here is a Lincoln who is not a sweet saint, who is not a champion of the law and the Constitution, but who uses his own legal experience and background and understanding as a conceptual tool, exactly the way the Constitution has been used for the past 200 years. Look, Lincoln even builds this ambiguity into the 13th Amendment to free the slaves, as I mentioned before. The third, it's either the 3rd or the 6th clause. I think it's the 6th clause, but I stand to be corrected. It might be the 3rd. But there is a clause in the 13th Amendment specifically to safeguard the civil rights of African Americans who are freed from slavery, which, of course, the history of the United States over the next century, and for that matter to this day, still urgently requires. But after the infamous sellout 1877, it is a dead letter for the next nearly 70 years, until Dwight D. Eisenhower sends the 101st Airborne Division to enforce a Supreme Court decision in favor of desegregated education into the city of Little Rock in 1957 and 1958, right? I think it's 57. But anyhow, however, does that mean that this key clause in the 13th Amendment is a dead letter over those 80 years? Not at all. That clause becomes a central brick, a keystone, a foundation block in the legal structure of law that made the United States the most powerful industrial nation in the history of the world, because it is used not to protect the rights of African Americans, which most of the radicals, Republicans in Congress consciously thought it did when they voted for it in 1864 while the war was still raging. No, that same clause is interpreted by successive Supreme Courts to uphold the legal rights of business corporations as if they were private individuals, that they should have all the rights supposedly going to private individuals, but to protect companies instead. And when you listen to former Vice President Dick Cheney, Senator Mitch McConnell, all these towering, powerful figures in the Republican Party to this day, their reverence to protect the rights of Coca-Cola, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, round up all the usual suspects, is passionate. They have no passion for upholding the civil rights of African Americans under the 1965 Voters Act, but to uphold the rights of the major corporations, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, you name it, that they're passionate for. That they're passionate for. But this comes from Lincoln too. So we can also ask ourselves the question, was Lincoln sincere in wanting to protect African Americans? Personally, I think he was. Because the sellout doesn't come under him or under his own chosen heir, Ulysses S. Grant, comes after them. Yeah. But would Lincoln also have knowingly shaped that law in order to protect corporations? And I have no hesitation in saying to you, yes, there's no question about this. Yes, he did. One of his best biographers in recent decades, already 30 or 40 years more now, and I forget the second name. It wasn't Doyle Stephen, but it was another Stephen, like you, a very fine biographer, makes the point that if Lincoln had lived, he was not the prairie saint that Carl Sandburg describes him as being, the suffering Christ from the prairies. Lincoln lived in the best house in Springfield that he built himself. He was the best paid lawyer in Springfield and one of the most successful in Illinois. What was his area of speciality? He was a railroad lawyer. He fought the New York interests, but not because he believed railroad interests were evil by nature. He was in favor of railroad interests. He was the architect of the forces that made the Union Pacific the dominant political as well as economic force in 3/4 of America by building the first transcontinental railroad, launched while he was president and completed while his heir, Ulysses S. Grant, was in the White House. They completed the whole thing in only 9 years. Extraordinary achievement for that time or any other time. They had a 40-year lead on Russia in tying a continental-sized nation together by railroads, thanks to Lincoln. That's what they were able to do. But if Lincoln had 4 sons, only one of them survived to adulthood. He later sat in Republican cabinets over the next 30 years. Lincoln's son lived so long, he attended the inauguration of a Lincoln Memorial under President Harding in Washington, D.C. in 1922. Lincoln sent his son Robert, who he loved dearly, and they were very close. Did he have him grow up in a log cabin the way he did? No, he sent him to Harvard Law School. He sent his only surviving son to Harvard Law School, and he never regretted the move. That is also essential to understanding the kind of man Abraham Lincoln was. None of this means that he was fake or false in any way about wanting to end slavery, or that he was not a moral man, or that he regarded slavery as anything other than an abomination. He did regard it as an abomination. But he was also a modern man. And if he had not been a modern, brilliant man who was alert to opportunity and education, he could not have succeeded as well as he did. For him, this was the great, and he's open about it, this is the greatness of America, that a man like me can become this. That even a man like I did, how I started in life, can become president. So any of you can as well. He's the living embodiment of de Tocqueville's new man of the Western Hemisphere.
That's good. I think it's a fair way to roll out to end this this wonderful presentation today, Marty. And I think one of the worst things that have really scrambled people's brains over the years has been this tendency to read history and especially Lincoln from either the standpoint of narrators and authors who try to paint a glorified angelic picture that's transhuman of the man, which is impossible to identify with as a fallible human being on the one hand, and then on the other hand to treat him like a tyrant who just abused the rights of everybody to defend their property and thus is a dictator. And these two polarizations really, you see it applied to attacks on JFK or misunderstandings of what JFK was, what FDR was, what any great person was. So I think your approach of being able to walk the line and actually get into, at the very least, the situation and the spirit of the times and see these as human beings who were exceptional human beings, devoted and who died for great ideas. I mean, this is exceptionally important that people really find that within themselves, especially in our trying times today, where we need this. I mean, we need this characteristic to be awoken very, very fast over a much broader swath of the population than we currently have it. And otherwise there's going to be no solutions for the coming storms that are going to get a lot worse before anything gets better. So thank you very much for supplying that.
Matt, as always, I'm the one to thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And David, it's a joy to see you there.
Yes, good night. Good evening. How are you?
Getting there, man,
Well, let's do this next Sunday. Next Sunday, we're going to move into the fourth movement, the 20th century, starting with a presentation by Nick Jones on Cheikh Anta Diop and the creation of the Pan-African movement, with an exploration of Kwame Nkrumah and many others who were admirers and students of the best of the United States experience, despite the fact that many people treat them as enemies of the United States because they're on the other side of the Cold War or something. It's all bunk. So we're going to have a presentation on the Pan-African movement. We're going to have something on the Bandung Conference and the rise of the five principles of peaceful coexistence of 1954, 55, 56 that arose with the leadership of Zhou Enlai and Jawaharlal Nehru and some very important African leaders as well, followed by something on JFK and FDR versus the Empire, delivered by Pascal Chevrier. So that'll be the fourth movement coming up next week. And this was, I think, a really great 4th of July celebration. So thank you, everybody, for showing up. And thank you, Martin, for giving your time and your insights.
Matt, always a pleasure and a privilege. You know that, man. Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Happy New Year.
Dave.
Bye.
Cheers.
Rumi.
Ciao.